The pit was 3 meters deep. At the bottom, an orc held her son against her chest, eyes fixed on the human above. She expected the worst. But the rope came down slowly, and everything changed. Dawn arrived quietly over Edric Hale's farm, as it always did in that forgotten corner of the arid desert of shadows. The orange light was still crawling across the horizon when Edric put on his wide-brimmed hat, fastened his leather vest, and stepped out through the creaking wooden door. His heavy footsteps on the dry earth were the only sound besides the weak wind sweeping across the wheat field. He made that round every day. He walked along the edge of the field, checked the fences, looked for signs that any animal had crossed in the night. It was a simple routine, unhurried. The farm wasn't large, but it was his. The clay-walled house, the barn, the well, the yard with chickens, all built with his own hands. Edric was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked with a few white strands. He was 42, but looked older. Not in his body, which was still strong. It was the eyes. The dark eyes carried a weight that never left, no matter how many mornings passed. 4 years ago, a fever had taken Mara. His daughter had been 7 years old. Curly hair, loud laughter, running through the same yard where the chickens pecked the ground today. In 3 days of fever, she was gone, and the silence that remained never left the house. Elena, his wife, carried the grief differently. She cooked more, cleaned more, grew quieter. Edric went to the field. He worked harder, slept less, tried not to think. That morning, he reached the southern edge of the field, where the earth gave way to a low forest of twisted shrubs and grey rocks. The vegetation was denser there. Animals sometimes came out to eat the wheat. That was why he had dug traps months earlier. Deep pits nearly 3 meters down, covered with branches and dry leaves. He stopped. A sound came from the forest that was not an animal. It was crying. Faint, muffled, like someone trying not to be heard but without the strength to hold it back. Edric stood still for a moment. His hand went to the six-shooter at his waist by instinct. But the crying continued, and there was something in that sound he recognized, though he tried not to recognize it. He moved forward slowly between the shrubs. The trap was open. The branches covering the pit had given way. He approached the edge and looked down. What he saw made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. At the bottom of the pit, sitting in the dark earth with her knees drawn to her chest, was an orc. Skin green as jade leaf, pointed ears, long dark hair held in an undone braid. The raw leather vest was torn, her face dirty with soil, her eyes sunken with exhaustion. Curled in her lap, still and quiet, was a child, small, green, with pointed ears and closed eyes. The orc lifted her gaze to Edric and waited. Her expression was not anger, it was resignation, like someone who already knows what is coming and simply waits for the end. Edric stood at the edge of the pit for a long second. The boy in her lap was far too small. He took his hand off the revolver and went to fetch the rope from the barn. There was something in that pit he could not ignore, a strange feeling in his chest. Like that moment had happened before in some dream he couldn't quite remember. The rope was thick, used for tying large animals, stored in the barn since the previous winter. Edric took it without rushing, coiled it over his arm, and walked back to the edge of the trap. The orc was still at the bottom, motionless, holding her son. When she heard the footsteps approaching again, she didn't move. She just waited, eyes fixed on the wall of earth beside her. Edric tied one end of the rope around a thick trunk nearby, tested the knot twice, and tossed the other end into the pit. The orc looked at the rope, then looked up at the human. Edric said nothing. He only pointed at the boy and gave a simple nod, the kind that means, him first. The orc hesitated. Not from distrust, but because her arms barely had any strength. She and the boy had been trapped for more than a day. No water, no food, in the cold bottom of the earth. But she breathed deeply, gathered her son in her arms, and stood with difficulty. Carefully, she looped the rope around the child under his small arms. Then she pressed her forehead to his cheek, as if saying something without words. Edric pulled slowly. The boy was light and rose, swaying gently, eyes still closed, lips dry and cracked. When he reached the edge, Edric caught him and laid him on the dry grass beside the pit. The child was breathing. Weakly, but breathing. He dropped the rope back down. The orc took longer. She was exhausted. She tried climbing while gripping the rope, but her hands kept slipping. Edric pulled without complaint, slow and steady, until she reached the edge and fell to her knees in the earth outside the pit. She stayed like that for a moment, on her knees, breathing hard, forehead nearly touching the ground. Then she pushed herself up with effort and crawled over to her son. The embrace she gave the boy was silent. Edric stood watching, then said, in a low voice, "My farm is just over there, come." She didn't answer right away. Those green eyes, large and deep, studied the man with an expression difficult to read. Not gratitude, not yet. Something between distrust and exhaustion. But she stood, picked up her son, and followed. They walked in silence through the low wheat field, under the sun climbing slowly. Edric went ahead, unhurried, rarely looking back. The orc came behind, carrying the boy who had woken and was watching everything with wide eyes, small mouth open. When they reached the farm, Eleanor was on the porch sweeping the floor. She looked up and stood still with the broom in her hand. Edric climbed the porch steps and said calmly, "They were trapped in the south pit. They need water and food." Elena looked at the orc, at the boy in her arms. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she went inside to get water. The orc stepped into the shade of the porch and sat on the wooden bench. The boy still hadn't let go of her neck. She drank water, cupped in both hands, slowly, eyes closed, and for the first time in a day and a half, she seemed to truly breathe. The strange feeling in Edric's chest returned, stronger now. Like that moment, that woman, that child, was somehow tied to something he had lost long ago. He couldn't explain it. He only knew that he could not look at the boy resting in the orc's arms without feeling the old familiar weight of a grief that had no name. Her name was Skadi. She said so at the end of the first day, when the boy was already sleeping, wrapped in an old blanket in the corner of the kitchen. Her voice was deep, with a guttural accent that stretched the syllables, but the human words came out clear. She had learned the language young, like many orcs from nomadic clans who lived near the borders. The boy's name was Eirik. He was 4 years old. Elena heard all of this sitting across the table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had already gone cold. Edric leaned against the wall, arms crossed without interrupting. Skadi didn't say much that night, only enough. She had left the Broken Fang clan 3 weeks ago, walking through the arid desert of shadows with her son and little more than the clothes she wore. No clear destination, just a way. "Why?" Elena asked in a neutral voice. Skadi looked at the mug on the table. "Because I refused to go to war." She didn't explain more that night, and neither of them pressed. In the days that followed, the orc slowly regained her strength. She ate carefully, never asking for more than was needed, never taking up more space than she was given. She slept with the boy in the barn, on hay bales, under blankets Elena had left folded at the entrance without a word. Elena watched her with that quiet look Edric knew well. Not hostility, assessment. She had always been like that, careful, measuring everything before drawing close. On the third day, it was Elena who said, "You can sleep inside the house. There's a room we don't use." Skadi looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. Just that. Eirik, on the other hand, had none of his mother's caution. By the second day, he had discovered the chickens and spent the entire afternoon chasing them around the yard, laughing with that wide-open laugh of a child who doesn't know how to pretend. His pointed ears moved when he laughed. The green skin glowed in the afternoon sun. Edric was fixing the fence when he heard the laughter. He stopped working, stood with the hammer in his hand, watching the boy run between the cackling chickens. And he felt that strange thing in his chest again, the feeling he couldn't name, that came back every time he saw the child, like the echo of something that had once existed and was gone. At night, alone in the bedroom, he lay staring at the wooden ceiling in the dark. He thought of Mara. On the 5th day, Skadi went to the wheat field without anyone asking. She simply went. She picked up an old hoe leaning against the barn and began hoeing the earth along the edges of the planting, where weeds grew fast. Edric found her working when he went to check the field in the late afternoon. She didn't stop. She kept going with the hoe, the muscular arms moving at a steady rhythm, the braids swaying. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know," she answered, and kept hoeing. Edric stood there for a moment, then picked up the other hoe leaning a little further down and started working the next row. They worked in silence until the sun dropped side by side without needing words. But there was something Skadi had not yet said, a larger reason for the exile, something the warriors of the Broken Fang clan would not simply leave behind. Edric didn't know that yet, but the arid earth surrounding the farm held tracks he had not yet learned to read. The story Skadi told, she told in pieces, not all at once, sitting at the table. It came out in fragments over the following week, between one task and another, like someone still testing whether it was safe to speak. The Broken Fang clan was nomadic, like most orc clans that crossed the arid desert of shadows. They followed the seasons, the animals, the water sources that appeared and vanished on the map of rocks and dust. They had their rituals, their laws, their code of honor, which was also a code of war. The leader was called Urak, the Split Tooth, a massive warrior with more than 2 decades of battle behind him. Tattoos covering both arms up to the neck, yellow eyes that didn't blink when they looked at you. 3 months ago, Urak had called the warriors together and announced an attack, a human settlement 2 days' walk away, small with few men to defend it. Farmers, cattle ranchers. He wanted the land, the animals, the grain reserves. "Burn it all," he had said. "Leave only ashes." Most of the warriors agreed. It was the clan's way. Strength was survival. Skadi had stood and said no. She told this to Eleanor one afternoon, while the two of them were inside kneading bread dough. Eleanor listened with her hands in the flour. She didn't interrupt. "There were children in that settlement," Skadi said, voice low. "I had seen them before, when I passed through weeks earlier, looking for water. I saw the children playing in the yard. They were small, like Eric." Elena was quiet. "Urak said that those who don't go to war are traitors," Skadi continued. "That compassion for humans is weakness. That weakness contaminates the clan." She pressed the dough hard, hands gripping the flour. "They gave me 3 days to leave. If I stayed, the punishment would be for me and Eric both." Elena looked up at the orc. She said nothing, but after a moment she placed her hand on top of Skadi's large green hand, covered in flour, and held it there for a few seconds. Skadi looked at the human hand over hers, and did not pull away. Eric, that same day, had dragged Edric by the index finger out to the yard to show him that he had found an enormous beetle under the stone near the well. The boy pointed, looked up at the farmer with shining eyes, and made a low, guttural sound of approval that must have meant something very important in his language. Edric crouched down to see the beetle, and laughed. A short, spontaneous laugh that escaped before he could hold it back. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed like that. That night, though, when the farm was quiet, Edric went out to the porch and stood looking at the dark desert. There was a restlessness in him that wasn't new, but it was growing. 2 days earlier, when he'd gone to Dusttown to sell eggs at the market, one of the men at the general store had mentioned strange tracks near the Green Shadow Canyon, large, a mix of boots and bare feet together, like a group moving through. Edric had said nothing, but he had kept the comment like a small stone in his boot. The kind you feel with every step without being able to remove it. The tracks in the canyon were no rumor. On the morning of the 10th day since Skadi and Eric had arrived at the farm, Edric found signs at the edge of the property. Marks in the dry earth along the southern field boundary, close to where the trap had been. Large steps, widely spaced, from someone heavy. And beside them, driven into the twisted trunk of a low tree, was an object he didn't recognize at first. It was a small totem made of bones, 3 animal vertebrae tied together with tendon cord, hanging from a dark string. There were carved marks on the middle bone. Edric didn't touch it. He went for Skadi. She came quickly, without asking questions along the way. When she saw the totem, she stopped completely, dark green eyes fixed on the object, jaw tight. "It's from the broken fang," she said after a moment. Her voice was too calm, the kind of calm that hides fear. "What does it mean?" Edric asked. "That they know where I am." She pulled the totem from the trunk, looked at it one last time, and broke it with her bare hands. The bones snapped with a dry crack. She threw the pieces far toward the desert. But the gesture didn't undo what it meant. Edric stayed quiet, then said, "How many are there?" "Urak never travels with fewer than 8 warriors." They walked back to the farm in silence. Skadi went straight to where her son was sleeping and stood in the doorway of the room for a long moment, just watching the child. That afternoon, Edric rode to Dust Town. He mounted his horse without saying much to Elena, only that he was going for supplies. She knew it wasn't just that, but didn't ask. The town was small, 1 main dirt road, the general store, the tavern, the Frontier Guardian's office, the blacksmith. Few people, a lot of heat. Edric went to the Guardian's office. The Frontier Guardian was named Rogan, a lean man with a grey moustache and a shotgun always resting on his desk. He listened to Edric with his arms crossed. "Nomadic orcs on the edges of the canyon," Rogan said without surprise. "I've heard talk, but as long as they don't cross the line, it's not my problem." "And if they do?" Rogan looked at him. "Then it becomes one." Edric left the office without having gotten anything useful. He stood on the wooden plank sidewalk, staring at the empty street. The sun beat down hard. On his way back, he stopped at the blacksmith and bought more powder. He had the lever-action rifle at home, the revolver at his hip, and an old shotgun in the barn. It wasn't much, but it was what there was. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, he went out to the porch and sat in the old rocking chair. The stars covered the desert sky in a staggering number. It was beautiful, in a way he sometimes forgot to notice. Skadi slipped out in silence and sat on the porch step, legs crossed. She looked at the desert alongside him for a while. Then she said, "You didn't need this trouble." "It was too late for that when I dropped the rope," he answered. She was quiet. Then, "Why did you drop it?" Edric looked up at the sky. "Because there was a child at the bottom of that pit." Skadi didn't answer, but something in her face shifted slightly, like a stone that moves 1 centimeter and changes the balance of everything. Neither of them went to sleep early that night. The shaman arrived before the warriors. Edric didn't know that yet, but there were signs. The following morning, the chickens didn't leave the coop. They stayed quiet inside, not clucking, huddled at the far end. The horse grew nervous in the stall, hooves striking the floor without stopping, and the well, when Edric went for water, had a different smell. Not rot. Something deeper, like wet earth after rain, but it hadn't rained. Skadi noticed the signs before Edric said anything. "A shaman walked nearby," she said, scanning the surroundings with narrowed eyes. "During the night, to test." "Test what?" "Whether there is spiritual protection in the place, whether there are guardians." Edric almost made a skeptical remark, but her expression stopped him. It wasn't superstition. It was knowledge. The difference between someone who grew up knowing certain things were real and someone who had simply never seen them. "Is there?" he asked. Skadi looked at the farm, at the wooden door, the small windows, the reinforced thatch roof. "Not yet," she said. "But there can be." She went into the barn and stayed there for nearly an hour. Edric didn't enter. When she came out, she held in her hand a leather strip with 3 small bones and a pale green crystal tied together. She walked to each corner of the farm, all 4 outer corners, and buried the strip shallowly in the earth, with firm movements and murmured words he didn't understand. Elena stood on the porch watching, arms crossed. Later, she said quietly to Edric, "Do you believe that works?" "I don't know," he said. "But she does, and she knows her people better than I do." Elena was quiet for a moment, then turned and went back inside. That day, Eric was quieter than usual. He didn't chase the chickens. He stayed close to his mother, holding the hem of Skadi's vest, wide eyes following everything around him. Children notice things adults pretend not to. In the afternoon, Skadi taught Edric to recognize the Broken Fang clan's markings, specific shapes carved into rock or bark, arrangements of small stones left along paths as messages. He paid close attention to everything. At the end of the day, he went to check the property boundaries alone, rifle in hand. He found nothing new. But on the way back, when he could already see the yellow light coming through the farmhouse windows, he felt that thing in his chest again. Not fear, something different. The awareness that there was something worth protecting, not just the farm or the animals. There was a 4-year-old boy sleeping inside that house who laughed at beetles, a woman who had chosen not to burn children and lost everything for it. And Elena, who had placed her hand over a stranger's flower-covered hand and held it there in silence. Edric stopped for a moment in the darkness of the field, the dry wind on his face, then walked inside, set the rifle behind the door, and sat at the table for supper. They came on the 13th day. It was early, the sun still low, the sky the color of rust. Edric was in the barn when the horse went completely still, nostrils flared open. He stepped out slowly, rifle in hand. Skadi was already at the front door, standing, eyes fixed on the direction of the desert. There were 8, emerging from the dry haze of the horizon like shadows that grew slowly. Warriors of the Broken Fang clan, tall, over 2 meters, dark green skin covered in tattoos, hair braided with bones and feathers. They carried bone spears, curved axes, horn bows across their backs, and leading them all, larger than the rest, was Urak the Split Tooth. He stopped 15 paces from the gate. The silence was absolute, only the low wind. "Skadi," he said. His voice was deep as distant thunder. "The clan no longer accuses you. Return with the boy. This ends here." Skadi came down from the porch slowly. She stood between the warriors and the house door. "I'm not going back." Urak looked at Edric. "The human protects you?" "No one protects me," Skadi said. "I choose to stay." Urak took a step forward. The warriors behind him moved with him, a slow, coordinated advance. Then the human dies first. What happened next lasted less than a minute, but Edric would remember it for many years. Elena came through the door with the old shotgun leveled at Urak, steady, no tremor in her hands. Eric cried out his mother's name from inside. Skadi grabbed the axe, leaning against the side of the house, and stepped forward, planting her feet in the earth, and Edric raised the rifle. Urak stopped. He looked at all 3, the farmer with the rifle, the human woman with the shotgun, and Skadi with the axe, eyes fixed on him without blinking. There was a very long moment where no one moved. Then the group's shaman, smaller than the warriors, with strips of bone covering his chest, stepped beside Urak and said something in a low voice in the clan's tongue. Urak didn't answer right away. The wind swept across the yard. Urak looked at Skadi for a time, then looked at the ground, at the marks she had made at the 4 corners of the farm. His expression shifted slightly. "The place holds protection marks," he said. more to the warriors than to her. The shaman murmured something again. Urak turned his back. "You chose weakness, Skadi," he said without looking back. "May weakness protect you." The warriors retreated with him, slowly, until they disappeared into the desert haze. Edric didn't lower the rifle until they had vanished completely. When he did, he noticed his hands were shaking slightly. Elena still had the shotgun raised. She lowered it slowly, breathed deep, and went inside to find Eric, who was crying softly within. Skadi stood in the yard for a long moment, staring at the empty horizon. Then she let the axe fall into the earth and covered her face with her hands. In the days that followed, the farm grew quiet in a different way. Not the empty silence Edric had known since Mara's death. It was a full silence, the kind that settles when many things have been said without words, and everyone needs time to let it sink in. Skadi was quieter than usual for 2 days. She worked, cared for her son, ate, but she was turned inward, processing something only she knew the size of. On the 3rd day, she went to find Edric in the field and stood beside him without speaking for a moment. He kept working, waiting. "Urak won't come back," she finally said. "How do you know?" Because he spoke of weakness. But in the clan's tongue, weakness that protects has another name. It's a blessing. The shaman convinced him the place holds guardian spirits. For the clan, attacking such a place brings a curse down on the warriors. Edric was silent for a moment. "The bones you buried at the corners?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "It worked." "It worked," she confirmed. There was something light in that exchange, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Eleanor, that same week, began teaching Skadi how to make bread the way her own grandmother had taught her. Not because she needed to, because she wanted to. The two of them spent afternoons in the kitchen with the golden window light, flour on their hands, talking slowly. Skadi didn't understand all human customs, and Elena didn't understand all of the orcs, but there was a genuine curiosity between them that needed no explanation. Eirik, free from the tension of the last few days, went back to running through the yard. He found a lizard under the stone near the well, and decided it was his friend. Elena watched him trying to convince the lizard to eat from the palm of his hand, and laughed, a short, real laugh that made Skadi look up from the kitchen window with a smile. Edric saw them all from the fence he was repairing, and stood still for a moment, tool in hand, watching. Something was happening there that was difficult to describe in a farmer's words. It wasn't normalcy. The situation was not normal. An orc woman, a human woman, and a green boy in the middle of a farm in the arid desert of shadows. But it was real. It was alive. It was the kind of thing that 4 years of silence had not allowed to exist. That night, Edric went to the small cemetery behind the house. It was a simple place, 3 wooden crosses in an area ringed by stones. One of the crosses was for Mara. He stood before it for a long time. He didn't cry. He had cried everything he had, but he spoke in a low voice as if she could hear. "There's a child here who laughs at beetles. I think you would have liked him." The wind passed softly. He went back inside. At the kitchen table, Eric had fallen asleep on his crossed arms, and Elena had placed a small blanket over him without waking him. Skadi was sitting beside him drinking tea. Edric sat down at the table, and the 3 of them stayed in silence for a time, the candle burning at the center, while the desert wind tapped softly at the windows. A month later, Rogan the frontier guardian came to the farm. He arrived alone on horseback, stopped at the gate, and took off his hat in the way someone does when asking permission to enter. Edric walked out to him with the rifle resting on his shoulder, casual. "What brings you here, Rogan?" The guardian looked at the farm, at Skadi, working the field with the hoe, at Eirik, chasing a chicken around the yard, at Elena on the porch. "There have been complaints in town," he said, "about orcs on your property." "There is an orc on my property," Edric said, "and a child. I know that. They work. They don't bother anyone." Rogan was quiet for a moment. He put his hat back on. "I only wanted to see for myself," he said, "to know what to say when people ask. And what will you say?" The Guardian looked at Eric, who had stopped running and was now staring up at him with wide, curious eyes, holding a chicken in his arms like a trophy. "There's nothing irregular here," Rogan said, and turned his horse. Edric watched the dust the horse kicked up along the road until it disappeared, then went back to the field. The weeks that followed were the most peaceful the farm had known in a long time. Skadi learned the difference between wheat ready to harvest and wheat that needed more time. Eric learned to say good morning out loud every day to everyone, including the lizard, which had become a permanent resident of the yard. Eleanor began teaching Eric to recognize letters. She drew them with her finger in the flour on the table, and he repeated them with great seriousness, tongue between his teeth from concentration. Skadi watched this from the kitchen doorway, and there was something in her face that was hard to name, a look that mixed gratitude and wonder, like someone who still couldn't quite believe they were being given this. One night, she and Edric stayed on the porch after everyone else had gone to sleep. "My clan had a belief," Skadi said, "that the spirits of those who have died stay close to the people they loved. Not to haunt, to watch over." Edric stayed quiet. "I think there is a spirit here," she continued. "From the very beginning, in the way you acted, in the way Elena is with Eric." He didn't respond for a time. "My daughter's name was Mara," he said at last. "She was 7 years old." Skadi nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "Elena told me. The wind passed through, carrying the smell of dry earth and something that might have been wild flowers of the desert, small and stubborn." "Thank you," Edric said. "Not for any one thing in particular. For everything, perhaps." "Thank you," Skadi answered. They sat in silence for a time, looking at the dark, star-filled desert. The farm was quiet. Alive, but quiet. No promises were made that night. No formal agreement. No grand words. Only 4 people in a small house in the middle of the desert who had found one another in an impossible way and chosen to stay. It was enough. But far away, beyond the Green Shadow Canyon, there were rumors that a new clan was moving through the desert, larger than the Broken Fang, with a name that travelers repeated in hushed voices in the taverns of Dusttown. The Black Moon Fangs, and they were moving toward the human farms. Destiny is a box of surprises, but life is meant to be lived, and one thing everyone on the farm discovered is that together, family is always stronger, and that no matter the hardships, they will always be there for one another. Some families are born from blood, others are born from choice, from a rope dropped into a pit, from flower-covered hands held in silence, from a child's laughter that fills a house that had forgotten how to smile.